You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for December 13th, 2019. This week will be a special show. I'll focus mostly on the XL trial controversy, and I'll contrast that with my experience at the FDA this week. The controversy got started when the BBC Newsnight program that aired recently. This reignited the debate over the XL study. Now recall that XL was the RCT comparing PCI to CABG in left main disease. New England Journal published 3-year results of this trial in 2016 and then 5-year results this fall. The conclusion of both these papers was equivalence of the two techniques. Now that means that literally all patients who have left main disease are going to choose PCI, given that it's a much easier procedure to recover from. However, a few weeks later, after the fall presentation of the 5-year results of XL, Dr. David Taggart, a surgeon, and others presented strong criticism of the trial interpretation during a session at the European Association of Cardiothoracic Surgeons. Taggart felt so strongly about this that he removed his name from the 5-year manuscript. To summarize, before the BBC Newsnight program aired, the problem that I had, and the problem that most people had with XL interpretation, was twofold. One was that the definition of MI and the use of peri-procedural MI, which was higher in the CABG arm, drove non-inferiority of the composite endpoint of MI, stroke, and death. The procedurally agnostic and biochemical dependent SCAI definition of MI used in the trial clearly favored PCI. The second problem was that the death rates were higher in the PCI arm. At the 3-year mark, the hazard ratio was 1.34, and this was not statistically significant, but was a trend. At 5 years, the hazard ratio for death was 1.38, and now the confidence intervals were 1.03 to 1.85, clearly significant, and the Kaplan-Meier curves show that the mortality rates were increasing over time. Now to the BBC program and what story it created. Now, it turns out that the BBC Newsnight program received the XL trials database from the 2016 results, and the statistician was able to run the analyses described in the trial's protocol. Now, BBC did not say how they received the data set, but one must believe there was a whistleblower who leaked the data. A noted statistician, Nick Fremantle from London, was able to review the data and was interviewed in the program. The key finding, I think, from the BBC Newsnight story was that the trial authors said in the trial protocol that they would report the results of MI as defined by the universal definition as a secondary endpoint, but they did not do so. Then, the independent analysis from BBC revealed that the hazard ratio for this secondary endpoint, MI, as determined by universal definition, was 1.79, strongly statistically significant in favor of CABG. In other words, there was an 80% higher rate of MI in the PCI arm. Now, I spoke with Fremantle and other statisticians who are experienced in trials, and all of these people confirmed that there was near 100% chance that this analysis was also run by the XL investigators. Thus, the issue is that the authors almost surely had this data on the secondary endpoint, but decided not to share it. In neither the New England Journal of Medicine nor the reviewers noticed that a secondary endpoint was not reported. Now, late in the afternoon yesterday, literally a few hours before I was going to tape this podcast, Excel authors published a 3,500-word response to the BBC program. Their document addresses many issues, but on the matter of not reporting the secondary endpoint of MI by universal definition, they write, quote, "The third universal definition of MI is based on troponins, the collection of which was optional in Excel and was unfortunately infrequently performed. Thus, reporting procedural MI rates according to universal definition was not possible." Okay, last night, again late last night, I spoke with Sanjay Kaul, who directed me to Table 3 in the Excel paper published in New England in 2016. This very large table shows 30-day and 3-year results of many, many different kinds of MI. The authors tell us about procedural, spontaneous, STEMI, non-STEMI, Q-wave, non-Q-wave MIs, but notably absent, Kaul said, is MI based on a third universal definition of MI. Now, early this morning, before I was taping, I pulled the paper on third universal definition of MI. The first author is Thygesen. It's in European Heart Journal in 2012. And they write in the biomarker section that if a troponin assay is not available, the best alternative is CKMB measured by typical assay. As with troponin, an increased CKMB value is defined as the measurement above the 99th percentile of the upper rate limit. Now, on social media, there is a great debate on the merits of which MI definition is better, and to me, this is a distraction. Everyone agrees that the entire notion of using periprocedural MI as an endpoint is open for debate. Consider that Nobel trial authors did not use periprocedural MI. Now, the other thing that's open for debate is the actual MI definition. The real issue is that by actively choosing to not publish this data or not explain why they didn't publish this data, and it's data that clearly would have changed the conversation of the results, the authors have inhibited clinicians the chance for critical appraisal of the trial. Their explanation about recording troponins does not convince me, but at minimum, they could have explained that in the paper or appendix in 2016. If we had the data on MI according to universal definition that the BBC Newsnight has discussed, would it not have been appropriate as an exploratory analysis to run the primary composite endpoint with the universal definition of MI? The BBC Newsnight's team did this, and they found that now the primary endpoint hazard ratio was 44% higher with a highly significant p-value in favor of CABG. Now, of course, this is a post hoc analysis, but it's curious. It's worthy of conversation. It's a reasonable analysis to do. But there was no such conversation in 2016 because the authors did not report the secondary endpoint analysis. Now, I am no trialist, but I see one purpose of secondary endpoints as a check on the validity of the primary endpoint. Now here, another reasonable definition of MI, the universal definition, finds a completely different result. Now I say it's reasonable because if it were not reasonable, or if it was useless, as someone alleged on Twitter, why would the authors have included it as a secondary endpoint? Now I also don't buy the author's argument that the SKY definition is better because the Ben Yehuda paper from the European Heart Journal in 2019 showed an association with cardiovascular death. That paper had methodologic problems, and association is not causation. Now here's the thing the BBC News gets right. Selective reporting of a pivotal trial is bad science, but it's also crucially relevant in this case because both at 3 years and at 5 years, the unbiased endpoint of death is higher in the PCI arm. Both New England Journal of Medicine papers on Excel state that there is equivalence in the two procedures, and there is clearly not. The non-inferiority in Excel was driven by a dubious periprocedural MI definition that favors PCI. The landmark analysis shows spontaneous MIs, aka real MIs, is higher in the PCI arm, and death trends are clearly favoring CABG over time. Think about it from the patient perspective. Let's say this 30% higher death rate at 5 years is indeed true. The 2016's conclusion that PCI and CABG for left main disease were equivalent was then put in the guidelines then, and it could have caused a lot of patients to die unnecessarily. This week, the European Association of Cardiothoracic Surgery pulled their support of the guidelines, calling for a reevaluation. The British Cardiac Intervention Society and SCAI have both said they remain confident in the XL trial. Sanjay Kaul told me that he has no sympathy for the EACTS because they should have never agreed to the 1A recommendation based on XL in the first place. Now, another aspect of the BBC program that deserves mention, without accusation, just mention, is the conflict of interest. Stent makers sponsored the XL trial. Numerous authors on the XL papers received support from stent makers. Numerous authors of XL also sit on guideline writing committees. These are not accusations. They are, however, relevant facts. I have 5 take-home messages from this story. First, to me, it is an absolute no-brainer that data sets from pivotal trials like XL should be open and reviewed by independent groups. This would discourage selective reporting and it would reduce errors in reporting. Venk Murthy told me he believes that there should be no 1A recommendation without independent review of the underpinnings trial. Now, this story doesn't happen unless BBC receives trial data, or in other words, open data. Now, I support the European Association Cardiothoracic decision to withdraw support for the guidelines until further review. The stakes are too high to be wrong. Yes, the 30% higher death rate could be the play of chance, but the fact that it's statistically significant in 5 years and the curves are widening over time suggests that it is real. If you look at the patients in Syntax with the longest follow-up, you'll also see a higher death signal. And thus, we should not be telling patients with left main stenosis that the outcomes of the 2 procedures are the same, because of course if we do, people are going to choose the less difficult PCI. But a person with left main disease might not choose PCI if he or she were told that 5-year death rates were 30% higher with PCI. Now, I also think that New England Journal is culpable here. Now, maybe I am naive about this, but I was under the impression that this journal was different. I had thought someone at New England Journal would look at the trial protocol, see what they said they were going to report, and if it was not there, flag the paper. Now, think about it. If New England Journal can't find selective reporting of a secondary endpoint, a key secondary endpoint, one that would clearly change the conversation of the trial, how are working stiff docs like me supposed to trust the evidence that goes into guidelines and then becomes measures of good doctoring? New England Journal should retract the paper, perhaps temporarily, and issue a statement on how this case of selective reporting got by them and what they will do to ensure future trials report their results fully. I would also like New England Journal to explain how this is not a perfect example of why we should have data sharing. Fourth, this story screams that we have to do something about guidelines. I'd rather have no guidelines, but since that seems unlikely, we simply cannot have trialists to receive payments from industry also writing the laws of medicine. Now, I know we need some expertise on these committees, but there needs to be more independent people with real voting and veto power who are help crafting the guidelines. And finally, medical evidence needs more transparency. There was a discussion in the BBC program about what the Data Safety Monitoring Board knew and when and who they talked to. Why is this not a matter of public record? That would surely help sort out some of the questions. Now, I want to talk about my experience at the FDA evaluating the drug vernakalant. And speaking of transparency and the power of open and independent review of source data, my experience sitting and voting on the Cardiovascular and Renal Drug Advisory Committee was thrilling. We were there to review the drug application for IV vernakalant for the termination of atrial fib. Now, FDA had previously reviewed this drug in 2007, and it received a favorable vote on efficacy, but the agency did not approve it on safety grounds. They called for more study. And a clinical trial called ACT5 was undertaken for that safety purposes, but after a short period, a patient died after receiving the drug, and that trial was put on clinical hold, and it's still on hold. The sponsor of the drug, however, has conducted an observational registry study called Spectrum, which I discussed last week. Spectrum looked at the use of vernakalant in Europe, where the drug is approved. Thus, Spectrum data was a large part of the sponsor's case at FDA for safety. And the sponsor had many brilliant presenters. Their case was compelling. They explained that many of the adverse events from the drug could have been avoided with a pre-infusion checklist and better patient selection. In fact, they pointed to the low safety events in the Spectrum registry as evidence that the drug could be given safely. I was thinking to myself, okay, this sounds pretty good. Then came the questions. Other members of the committee, Paul Ridker, Michael Gibson, Milton Packer, asked probing questions and exposed serious weaknesses of this pre-infusion checklist and some of the data that the sponsor presented. But the most amazing presentation came from Dr. Preston Dunman from the FDA. He first showed that this drug is not atrial specific, but indeed it is a potent 1C-like drug that has significant negative ionotropic properties. He looked at animal studies, and then the depressant effects of this drug last longer than IV flecainide and persist to 90 minutes. And in fact, there were deaths in the animal lab during drug infusions. Now, with the basic science and animal data as background, Dunman then went on and took on the safety data from the clinical studies. And remember, friends, he had access to the source data. This allowed him to make the case that the drug did indeed play a causal role in at least 2 patient deaths. He also made comments that the patient harm was not predictable based on clinical grounds. He went and looked at the Spectrum data and pointed out the many weaknesses that this registry had. For instance, it's a selection bias, it's observational, non-consecutive enrollment, etc. And he felt that this was just too weak data to rely on for safety. In the end, the committee voted 11-2 against approval of the drug. I left that meeting feeling confident in the FDA, at least this part of the FDA. But also, it was crystal clear to me that the adjudication of science would be far better if clinical trial data was open and could be analyzed by independent teams like people like Dr. Dunman. The XL controversy juxtaposed with the clarity of this independent review of clinical data I saw at FDA was a remarkable contrast in how science could be judged. Professor John McMurray sent me a slide earlier this month, and on it shows a list of some of the greatest medical advances of the century. Evidence-based medicine, or the RCT, was one of them. And my friend Vinay Prasad calls the RCT the greatest advance of modern medicine. Yet us regular doctors and our patients can't benefit as much from the RCT if the results and interpretation are clear, unbiased, and independently verified. EBM, evidence-based medicine, needs to move closer to the critical appraisal I saw at FDA. This would be a huge advance, and the first step is to have open data. Okay, friends, this is one of those weeks where 2 stories predominated. I will return to the usual format of 4 to 5 stories next week. One in particular I am working on is a beautiful paper from the group of Andrew Cron and David Burney from Canada on their formulation of a score for predicting complications from cardiac device implantation. Stay tuned for that and other stories. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I am grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, if you like this podcast, please tell your friends. Consider subscribing and giving it a review so that other people can find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.